Okay, good afternoon, every afternoon session. Professor Eric Stark Maskin, Mr. Uwe Morawetz, distinguished guests, University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce administrators, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special lecture on why global markets have failed to reduce inequality. Once again, it is a great honor for our university to host such a special speech by the Nobel laureate. And in a very short time, we will start with a welcome remark by Assistant Professor Dr. Sawani Thairungrod. May I call upon Dr. Sawani Thairungrod to give her welcome remark.
Professor Eric S. Maskin, UTCC administrators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, may I welcome all of you to our special lecture co-organized by University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and the International Peace Foundation. This special lecture is held as one of the activities of UTCC Academic Week, which is organized to be the week when UTCC faculties and students from all schools of UTCC will present their papers in addition to special lecture on why global markets have failed to reduce inequality, which I would like to thank Professor Eric S. Maskin for accepting the invitation to join the academic week by giving the lecture which will become the highlight of this event. UTCC has already organized 18 series of special lectures, most of them through the cooperations with the International Peace Foundation, to hold special lectures from Nobel laureates for economics. In the past, we have had the honors from many Nobel laureates as follows: Professor James Heckman, 2000 Nobel laureate; Professor Robert A. Mundell, 1999 Nobel laureate; Professor Finn E. Kitland, 2004 Nobel laureate; and Professor Engel, 2003 Nobel laureate, as well as Mr. James D. Wolfenson, former president of the World Bank. UTCC is proud to work with International Peace Foundation in building up a culture of peace, which can be achieved through broad international cooperation among higher education institutes by creating networks and partnerships with a broad range of institutions, organizations, educationalists and researchers, as well as with civil society at large. In the lecture today, Professor Eric Maskin, 2007 Nobel laureate for economics, will lead you all to the insight of why global markets have failed to reduce inequality. A great deal of talk is heard these days about the problem of inequality, also about globalization. Is it true that globalization creates new pressure of inequalities within countries, and how? Please follow. May I thank Professor Eric S. Maskin, Mr. Uwe Morawetz, Chairman of International Peace Foundation, honorary guests, participants, and audiences. I truly believe this lecture will provide a good forum, motivation, and inspiration for interesting people and public. All through this lecture, I can picture all of you as a caravan of peacemakers moving along the road to equality and harmonious world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sawani Thairungrod, the Vice President for Research. And at this auspicious moment, I'd like to invite Mr. Uwe Morawetz to give the opening address.
Sawadee Krap, and welcome to the third ASEAN event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna, Austria. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including the country's major universities. Having started in November last year, Bridges will now be continuously held in Thailand, the Philippines and Cambodia until April this year, involving the participation of Nobel laureates from all fields as well as other eminent keynote speakers. The third ASEAN series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, which was initiated by the United Nations General Assembly. It follows the series of 350 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia since 2003. The pluralistic program of Bridges highlights the International Peace Foundation's intercultural and transdisciplinary approach towards peace. The foundation does not take sides, but acts as a mediator by creating an independent platform for dialogue where representatives of science, culture, politics, religion, the media, and youth can meet, share their viewpoints, listen to each other, and find mutual ways of understanding and cooperation. Therefore, the foundation itself is a bridge and a facilitator between different language groups in our divided societies, where politicians speak another language than artists, and business and religious leaders another one than scientists. In a highly interdependent world, problems cannot be solved only by one of these language groups only, but by finding ways of working together. After the success of Bridges in Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia, the International Peace Foundation has now been invited by other ASEAN countries to build further bridges towards peace and international understanding by expanding its program in Southeast Asia to stimulate the intellectual, scientific, and cultural exchange in the region. The aim of Bridges is to facilitate and strengthen dialogue and communication between societies in Southeast Asia with their multiple cultures and faiths, as well as with peoples in other parts of the world. The aim of Bridges is to promote, therefore, understanding and trust. It aims at building bridges with local universities and other institutions in Southeast Asia to build long-term relationships with Nobel laureates in all fields, which may result in common research programs and other forms of collaboration. By enhancing science, technology, and education as a basis for peace and development, the events may lead to a better cooperation for the advancement of peace, freedom, and security in the region with the active involvement of the young generation, ASEAN's key to the future. This is why Bridges is not designed as a one-time conference or event and then everything is over again and forgotten, but as a continuing process of synergies to make this series of events a sustainable success for Thailand, for Cambodia, for the Philippines, and for Southeast Asia as a whole. I'm grateful to the President, Dr. Chiradet Osawat, and the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, as well as to our other partners and sponsors who have enabled us to make the idea of Bridges a reality. I would like to say thank you to everyone present today for taking part in this program. May it help us to facilitate a new culture of peace through dialogue, transcending its definition as merely the absence of war or armed conflict, into a new understanding what the basis for peace is: education. In this spirit, we welcome today the 2007 Nobel Laureate for Economics, Professor Eric Maskin, who has agreed to come to Thailand to support the events. We all look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you very much, Mr. Morawetz, Chairman of the Board of Directors, International Peace Foundation. And now it's time for the highlight of the day. And today I have an honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Eric S. Maskin. He's a famous American economist who attended Harvard University, where he received his AB in mathematics and PhD in applied mathematics. While being a research fellow at Jesus College, he received an honorary MA degree from University of Cambridge. He was a professor at MIT and Harvard. Currently, he's a visiting lecturer at Princeton University, New Jersey. Most of his work in the mid-70s was in the area of implementation theory. In the early 80s, Professor began his work on the subject of optimal oceans, and in the early 90s, he gave advice to the Bank of Italy on possible reforms in the system of oceaning treasury bonds. And nowadays, Professor works in diverse areas of economic theory, which strongly influence on many areas of economics, political science, and law. He is particularly well known for mechanism design, implementation theory, and dynamic games, which lead to optimal outcomes for all participants. Professor Maskin received various honorary doctorate degrees. Moreover, in 2007, he was awarded the Nobel Laureate for the prize in economics for having laid the foundations of mechanism design theory, a specialized form of game theory. And today, Professor Maskin is going to give a special speech on why global markets have failed to reduce inequality. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Eric S. Maskin.
Thank you for that very warm welcome. Before I start, I just want to make sure that the microphone is working properly. Can you hear me in the back all right? Good, good. Not that you want to hear me, but in case you do, I wanted to make sure that the sound system was working properly. Well, it's a very great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you here at the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce on what I regard as a critical problem that the world is facing today, why global markets have not reduced inequality. It's unquestionably true that in the last 20 or 25 years or so, there has been an enormous increase in globalization. And by globalization, I mean the idea that more goods are traded between countries, and also the idea that there is more production of goods across national boundaries. What do I mean by more production of goods? across national boundaries? Well, take the phenomenon that Americans and Europeans encounter all the time. They often run into trouble with their computers, their personal computers, and need some advice about what to do. Well, there's typically a telephone number you can call for technical assistance, but when they call that number, they don't get someone in the US or in Europe, they typically get someone in India. And this is a everyday example of the internationalization of production. We are instantly linked to people everywhere in the world as part of the production process. That's a very important part of globalization, which I will be emphasizing later on. Well, why has globalization occurred? It's occurred because, first of all, transportation costs have fallen over time quite dramatically. But even more important, communication costs have fallen dramatically over time. So we can now communicate through electronic means instantly for almost no cost. There has also been a change in the international legal environments. We now have very important international trade agreements which essentially eliminate most important tariffs. This is true in North America with the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is true in Europe with the European Union. And it's now true here in Southeast Asia with the China-ASEAN free trade area. So the world is gradually getting rid of trade barriers. And this has promoted globalization. Globalization has brought with it many promises. One promise that its supporters made when globalization got underway was that this was going to help the poorer countries of the world. It was going to create prosperity where before there was only poverty. And there's a sense in which this promise has been achieved, at least to a certain extent. And the most spectacular examples of the success of prosperity through globalization have been China and India, both of which have grown by spectacular amounts over the last 20 years. And in both cases, that success had a great deal to do with the fact that they were operating in global markets. But China and India are very far from the only examples of poor countries achieving some degree of prosperity through globalization. Unfortunately, there was another promise that was made which was not delivered on, and that was the promise that the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots in poorer countries would be reduced. In other words, it was suggested by the proponents of globalization that globalization would reduce inequality. In this case, sadly, just the opposite has been true in many countries of the world. And one particular example I could give you, it's an example that I have studied myself, and so I have a great deal of experience with this example, but I could equally well talk about other examples too. I'm going to talk about Mexico, but I could be talking instead about Cambodia, for example. Much the same story applies to Cambodia. So Mexico joined what's called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was an agreement which lowered the tariffs that it faced in 1985, so 25 years ago. And this agreement had the effect of reducing tariffs by more than 50%. And almost overnight, there was a dramatic increase in the amount of foreign investment in Mexico. In fact, over the course of 5 years, foreign investment quadrupled, increased by a factor of 4. At the same time, incomes of white-collar workers, these are highly skilled workers, went up by a very significant amount, 13%. But the wages of blue-collar workers, workers without high skill levels, without much education, actually declined by 14%. And this is by no means a story which is unique to Mexico. The same story applies to many other countries in Latin America and also to many countries in Southeast Asia. Now you might ask, well, why does this matter? If the average prosperity of a country goes up, why should we care if inequality goes up, if the gap between the rich and the poor goes up? Well, I would argue that there are at least 3 reasons why we should be very concerned about this increase in inequality. The first is simply a moral argument, the idea that we're all human beings and therefore we should all be treated equally to the extent that this is possible. But we see that thanks to globalization, different people are being treated extremely differently, which offends our egalitarian or moral instincts. But even if you don't accept that argument, you have to remember that particularly in poor countries, the bottom half of the income distribution corresponds to people in desperate circumstances, typically. These are the poorest people of the world. These are people who are living well below the poverty line. And so even if you don't care about inequality per se, you may be attracted to the idea that doing something about this desperate poverty is an important imperative. And even if you don't accept that argument, you might be a political realist and recognize that inequality contributes to social and political instability. And so simply for the sake of having a stable society, it's important to do something about inequality. So for all those reasons, I would submit that inequality is something that we must react to. Well, should we be surprised by the fact that inequality has gone up in poor countries because of globalization. Is this something which contradicts common sense or contradicts what we thought we knew? Interestingly, the answer is yes. There is a very well-established theory in economics, a very well-established principle in economics called the principle of comparative advantage. This is a proposition that goes back literally 200 years. It goes back to the early 19th century and the British economist David Ricardo. And it's been a very successful principle in predicting what has happened in all previous globalizations. The globalization that we're going through now is by no means the first. There have been at least 3 previous globalizations in the last several hundred years. The most important before the current one was in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and in every previous globalization, inequality decreased, not increased. So the theory of comparative advantage predicts that free trade will reduce inequality in poor countries, and that means that there's something different about the current globalization. Let me try to explain why the theory of comparative advantage predicts that inequality should decrease. Well, any explanation for trade has to answer the question, why is it that countries trade with one another? And the theory of comparative advantage says that countries trade with one another because these countries are different. In particular, they are different in their factors of production. What do I mean by a factor of production? A factor of production is just an input to the production process. So it's a comparative advantage in producing a high-tech product like computer software. Similarly, Mexico has a comparative advantage in producing goods where skill doesn't matter so much, such as agricultural products, corn, for example. Well, to see how globalization affects production, let's do a thought experiment. Let's look at production before globalization takes place, and then we'll imagine that barriers to trade between the US and Mexico are removed, and we'll look at production after the trade barriers have been removed, after globalization occurs, and the difference between the two can be attributed to globalization. So let's do that. Before trade has occurred, if Americans are to be able to consume both software and corn, American companies have to produce both, because we're assuming that they can't get these goods from overseas because the barriers to trade are too high. And similarly, Mexican companies are going to have to produce both software and corn for their consumers. But there's a sense in which when Mexican companies produce software, that is an inefficient use of their labor force. Their labor force is better designed, according to the theory, to produce corn because most of their labor force is unskilled. And so if the Mexican production is diverted into software, that is an inefficient use of the labor force. And in fact, low-skilled Mexican workers will be hurt by this software production because if those companies that are producing software were producing corn instead, they would have to be hiring low-skilled workers to harvest the corn. Because they're producing software, they don't need the low-skilled workers. And so that reduces the demand for low-skilled workers. And at the same time, the software production raises the demand for high-skilled workers because software places heavy demands on high-skilled workers. So because Mexico is producing software before globalization occurs, there's going to be upward pressure on high-skilled wages, downward pressure on low-skilled wages. The low-skilled workers are not needed so much. The high-skilled workers are needed a lot. Okay, so now what happens when the trade barriers are removed and there's globalization? Well, now it's no longer necessary for the U.S. to produce corn, and it wasn't so efficient for them to produce corn anyway because they had this highly skilled workforce. So they will shift from corn to software and import corn from Mexico. And similarly, Mexico will shift production away from software to corn, and they'll import their software from the U.S. And what effect will this have on wages? Well, Mexico will now be producing more corn and less software before. So that will raise the demand for low-skilled workers because corn makes a lot of use of low-skilled labor. So the demand for low-skilled work is increased. The demand for high-skilled labor is reduced. And so high-skilled wages will fall. Low-skilled wages will rise. And inequality will be reduced. This is the classic argument that all supporters of globalization used to give for why globalization would help the poor. It was this argument. And as I said, this is not a new argument. This argument goes back hundreds of years, and it worked for many, many decades. It worked in all previous globalizations. But it failed for the current globalization. And the question is, why did it fail? One notable success of the theory of comparative advantage was in the late 19th century. There, globalization came about because the cost of transporting goods across the Atlantic Ocean went down. Shipping costs went down. Now, Europe, at that point, had the bigger proportion of low-skilled workers compared with the U.S. And, in fact, what we saw, which was exactly what the theory predicted, was a fall in inequality in Europe because of globalization. So low-skill wages rose, high-skill wages came down in Europe. But as I say, the theory has not worked for the recent globalization. And so for that reason, there has been an anti-globalization movement which has suggested that perhaps globalization wasn't such a good idea after all. I have to say I don't agree with the idea that globalization is not a good idea because as I said at the beginning of my talk, even though inequality has increased, so has average prosperity as a result of globalization. So globalization has not been a out-and-out failure. It's had many successes too. But we do want to understand why inequality has increased. And that is a project that I have been undertaking to study together with an economist, Michael Kramer, at Harvard. And let me tell you a little bit about the theory that we propose, which we think improves on the theory of comparative advantage. But the essential starting place is to go back to thinking about globalization as the internationalization of production. So I mentioned before that if you want computer assistance in the US or Europe, you're going to get someone in India. That's an example of the internationalization of production. In fact, the very way that computers are manufactured these days is an international effort. Typically, computers will be designed in the US, they will be programmed somewhere else, perhaps in Europe, and then they will be put together in China. So complicated products like computers, like pharmaceuticals, are typically produced internationally. They cannot be confined to single countries. So let's think of globalization as the internationalization of production. So that's one ingredient. Another important ingredient to the theory is the idea that labor doesn't just come in two varieties, high skill and low skill. There are actually many skill levels in between. For my purposes today, I'm going to assume that there are 4 levels, but that's just to simplify the discussion. In fact, there are many more than just 4 levels. Another ingredient is the idea that when something is produced, there are typically multiple tasks that have to be performed. Modern production consists of breaking up the production process into different tasks which different people do. Again, I'm going to simplify matters and suppose that there are just 2 tasks. There's what we might call the managerial task, the task that managers perform, and we'll suppose that this is relatively sensitive to the skill level of the manager, and that there's also a task of the subordinates, which is not so sensitive to skill. So 2 tasks. I'll also suppose that there are 2 countries, just as in our comparative advantage example, a rich country and a poor country, say the United States and Mexico, or the United States and Cambodia. And the rich country, we'll suppose, has workers of skill levels A and B. The poor country skill levels C and D, where A is bigger than B, is bigger than C, is bigger than D. So the reason why the rich country is rich is because it has workers of higher skill levels than the poor country. Now, how does output get produced? Well, it gets produced by putting two people together to perform the two tasks involved. So output is produced by matching or putting together a manager and a subordinate. And how much output gets produced depends on the skill levels of the people occupying those tasks, those positions. Now I'm going to use a little bit of math here. I hope this doesn't distress anyone. If it does, just close your eyes, because it'll all be over soon. But I'm going to suppose that outputs equals the skill level of the manager squared. Now, the reason for squaring the manager's skill level is just to get across the idea that output is very sensitive to the manager's skill times the skill level of the subordinates. Output is not so sensitive to the subordinate's skill level. So, for example, if the manager had skill level 4 and the subordinate had skill level 3, output would be 4 squared, 4 times 4, times the skill level of the subordinate 3, or 48. That's just one possible example. Now, the way that workers are matched with one another is going to depend on the environment. It's going to depend on the distribution of skills that are available. And that's why globalization is going to be important. Globalization will change the distribution of available skills, because now you'll be able to get skills of people who live in different countries, as well as skills of people who live in your own country. But just to give you an example of the different kinds of patterns we could have, let's imagine that the population consists of 2 workers of skill 3, I'll call them 3 workers, and there are 2 workers of skill level 4. I'll call those 4 workers. Now, one way that they could be matched is that a 4 worker could be matched with a 4 worker could be matched with a 3 worker, and the other 4 worker could be matched with the other 3 worker. I'll call this cross-matching, because in this case, each worker is matched with another worker of a different skill level. So that's cross-matching, and this produces a total output of 96. Another way that they could have been matched is that the 4 worker could have been matched with the other 4 worker. The 3 worker could have been matched with the other 3 worker. This is what's called homogeneous matching, because now the manager and the subordinate have the same skill level. But this produces output which is less. It's only 91. And therefore, if we think that there's competition for workers, we would expect that we will get this pattern of matching, because it produces higher output. Competition gives you greater efficiency, and greater efficiency here means this output rather than this output. But this conclusion that we get homogeneous matching depends very much on the distribution of skills that is available. If we change that distribution, If we change that distribution, and so now we have 2 4 workers and 2 2 workers instead of 2 3 workers, we get a different pattern of matching. Now, if we compare cross-matching with homogeneous matching, we find that homogeneous matching gives rise to higher output, 72 rather than 64. So we don't always get cross-matching. We don't always get homogeneous matching. It all depends on the distribution of skills. Well, this brings me to the comparison between what happens before globalization and what happens after globalization. Remember I said that the rich country will have skill levels A and B, the poor country will have skill levels C and D, which are lower. What pattern of matching do we get before globalization? Well, it can be shown that we will get, I'm not going to go through the arguments, but it's not difficult. It can be shown that the pre-globalization pattern that we will get is that A workers will be matched with B workers in the rich country, and C workers will be matched with D workers in the poor country. So we will have cross-matching in both countries before globalization, so before production has been internationalized. What happens when the barriers to international production come down? We get a dramatically different pattern. Now the C workers from the poor country are matched with the B workers in the rich country. The D workers are left all to themselves, and the A workers are left all to themselves. Think of it this way. Before you could have international production, the D workers got the benefits of working with higher skilled people, the C workers. But once international production became possible, the C workers got a better opportunity overseas. They got to match with the B workers. That was very good for the C workers, but not so good for the D workers. The D workers were now forced to fend for themselves. They were left to their own devices. So let's explore the implications of this for wages. We see that before globalization, the D workers matched with the C workers. That was good for them because they were working with higher skilled people. That meant that they were more productive. But after globalization, the D workers are left by themselves. That means that their wages will fall as a result of globalization. At the same time, the wages of the C workers go up because they now have this new opportunity, the opportunity to work in an international company with B workers. Think of the C workers as the Indian call center workers who now have the opportunity to work for Microsoft or Dell overseas. So the consequence of all of this is that inequality has risen. The gap between the C workers and the D workers' wages has gone up as a result of globalization. Very different argument from comparative advantage. Now, what do we learn from this argument when it comes to policy? If we're worried about inequality, what do we do according to this story? Well, the whole problem, according to this story, is that the D workers' skills are too low for them to be attractive to global markets. If we could somehow raise the skill levels of these D workers, they too would have international employment opportunities, matching opportunities, and they too would see their wages rise. So somehow we have to raise these skill levels of the D workers. The problem is that raising skill levels is expensive. It costs something, and the question is who's going to pay for it? Well, producers are not going to pay for it, or they're not going to pay for enough of it, because if a producer, a company, invests in raising a D worker's skill level, that worker can then go off and work for some other company. You know, we don't have slavery, so people cannot be forced to work for the company that invests in them. But that means that the investment in training that the company has made is lost. So producers are not likely to invest enough in education to solve the inequality problem. And of course, the workers themselves can't make the investment because they're too poor to do so. They are, after all, at the bottom of the economic spectrum. So that means that some third party is going to have to make the investments. It could be domestic governments. It could be some international agency, an NGO perhaps. It could take the form of foreign aid. It could be some combination of all of the above. That is, it could be a domestic government offering a subsidy to a private company for training its workers. But some third party is going to have to get into the act to solve the inequality problem. It's not going to happen on its own. And so, if you accept this theory, and I think there is strong evidence behind this theory, we come away with the conclusion not that we should try to stop globalization, because after all, globalization does, on average, increase prosperity, but rather to make the investments in low-skilled workers, the D workers of the world, to enable them to benefit from globalization too. That's the message. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Maskin. Any question from the floor? We have only a few questions. Okay. A few questions, please. Microphone, could you please?
If the D workers raise their productivity not quite to the level of the C workers, but to the level of the C workers minus epsilon, some small amount, would they still be frozen out?
Yes. So that's a good question. How far do we have to raise skill levels for it to make a difference? And the answer is we do not have to raise it all the way to the sea level. We just have to raise it to the point, going back to this picture here, we just have to raise it to the point where it becomes attractive for at least some of the C workers to match with D workers, or it becomes attractive for at least some of the B workers to match with D workers. That is well short. To do that, skill level of D workers can still be well short of the C level. The problem with the picture as it stands is that the D workers are so far down that they're unattractive to both of these groups. So they're left by themselves. And that I would submit is what has happened in many developing countries around the world. The D workers simply have nothing attractive to offer global markets.
But that means essentially that the distribution of your skill measured by some scalar, some number, is almost discrete. It's not continuous.
Okay. In this example, it's discrete. Of course, in reality, it's going to be closer to continuous. But the same argument that I have made in the case of 4 levels of skill.
More D workers, what you're interested in, not all D workers move over, at least some.
At least some. So we're not going to solve the problem of inequality completely. That is beyond our powers. But we can certainly improve the inequality problem significantly by moving some D workers.
I have one observation and one question. The first observation is that your theory lays upon the fact that there is a teamwork between people of different skills. And secondly, your second implication, policy implication, seem to assume that the result depends very much that the skill of the workers are general skill, not specific skill. What happens if workers acquire specific skill? What happened to your theory?
Right. So you're quite correct. That I am assuming for the purposes of this argument that at least some skill is general. And by general skill, I mean that it's transferable from one company to another, from one task to another. If all skills were completely specific to the task at hand, then we would not have a problem. And the reason we would not have a problem is that now we wouldn't have to have governments get into the action. All investment could be made by the companies themselves. If I'm a worker and you're considering hiring me, and the skill, and you're considering giving me training, if the skills I learn can only be used by you, then you don't have to worry about losing your investments.
That assumption affects your conclusion on inequality.
It's not. It's going to. Yes, it's going to affect the conclusion on inequality because in a world where all skills are completely specific, it will pay workers. It will pay workers to train. It will pay companies to train D workers. We won't have any D workers left anymore because they will all be privately trained. It's precisely because not all skills are specific, if there is at least some degree to which they are general, that that dilutes the incentive for private companies to do all of the investment themselves. So so if we're going to do something about inequality, somebody else, government or NGOs or international organizations, have to get into the act. It's not going to happen through the market itself.
Now, if the world change in such a way that the production technique requires a combination of teamwork between C and D,
yes,
then your result will change. Like, if D workers are always required in the combination, D workers are required in some kind of...
Well, all right. So the assumption in this model is that we can use workers of any skill level for any task, but the problem is that if we use workers of sufficiently low skill, we won't get much outputs. That's the critical assumption. The idea that we can always use lower skilled people, but then if we do that, we'll sacrifice output. Yeah, good questions. There are also questions back there.
And no, I was you showed two models of globalization.
Right.
One, I mean, the old one and the new one.
Right.
Can they be compared? I mean, because when you talk about reducing the tariffs, you're talking about products, and when you're talking about computer software, they don't have any tariffs. I mean, they move around the world without paying tariff. I mean, according to the WTO, they are tariff zero. And when we are talking about corns, they have tariffs. So can be these two models of globalization compared?
Well, in fact, I think both models have validity. So I'm not arguing that the old model, the theory of comparative advantage, is irrelevant at this point. Of course, it still has some explanatory power. But the point is that so much of production is international now that the theory of comparative advantage is not sufficient by itself to explain what we observe. And so you should think of this new theory as not replacing the theory of comparative advantage, but rather supplementing it and going beyond the old theory to explain the new reality.
Yeah. Can I say something more? Because in the old model, I mean, we have movement of products, right, goods.
That's right.
And it was produced by reducing the tariffs. This globalization is produced because there is a technological revolution, right? And there is a technology advancement that allows, I mean, this trading of software around the globe without reducing. This is important from the political point of view, that some of the NGOs are opposing the FTAs, right? Because they say, I mean, reducing the tariff will increase inequality. But there is a globalization being produced not because of reducing the tariff, because we have a technological revolution that is different in the case of software, for example.
Well, reducing tariffs is important as well. That is, if you are assembling computers in China, then it's important that tariffs between China and the rest of the world be low in order to get those computers out of China. Otherwise, they'll be stuck there. So reduction of tariffs does play a role in this story. But you're quite right that the technological revolution, which allowed companies to coordinate production across different continents, to be able to design in the US and assemble in China, that technological capability is also important. And it's that new technological capability which distinguishes this globalization from previous ones, the internationalization of production. And it's why the theory of comparative advantage, the old theory, is no longer the end of the story, why it's no longer enough to explain what has happened. You should get the attention of...
Hi. Sorry. I don't know if this question has been asked already, but I couldn't quite hear from the front. But I have a question related to the different skill levels.
Yes.
So you mentioned that the C workers would have a better opportunity to match with higher skilled workers, B workers from the richer country. Mm-hmm. My question is, what though would make the B workers match with the C workers, whereas they were better off matched with higher skilled A-level workers earlier before the trade?
Okay. I should emphasize that just because the B workers used to be matched with the A workers and now they're matched with the C workers does not mean that the B workers are worse off. The B workers are actually better off too. And the reason that's so is because the C workers are paid less than the A workers, and so there's more left over for the B workers. So just because you're matched with someone of lower skill doesn't necessarily mean that you are worse off. The B workers are better off because of globalization. The C workers are better off. The B workers are better off. It's the D workers who suffer. And the A workers actually suffer too. But we don't care about the A workers because they're rich anyway. So it's the D workers who really get the bad deal here. And it's the D workers that we need to do something about.
So what is the reason why this mechanism doesn't apply to previous globalization?
It's because previous globalizations were not essentially about the internationalization of production. So in previous globalizations, we did not have people in Europe jointly producing goods with people from the US. We certainly had trade of goods between the two, but the goods were either produced in Europe and sent to the US or produced in the US and sent to Europe. The distinctive feature of this globalization is that we have these multi-country goods, goods which are produced by people from different countries. And that makes a huge difference to the implications on wages.
In other words, production taking place under different groups.
Right. Right. That's right.
Thank you, Professor Maskin. Thank you for giving us a great lecture today. My name is Guibo Shan from China. What I learned from your lecture is that people should be educated. People should improve their skill level. And I have, my concern is that what if, everybody's educated, everybody, is smart, just like you, and
you don't want all people to be like me.
And who's going to iron your clothes? Who's going to make, motorbikes for you? And the other question is about the application of the theory. We know that lots of other elements and forces are going to influence the application of a theory, right? Such as political system. Say the theory is very good, but how can we apply that theory in a country like Myanmar, with a totally different social and political environment. And what kind of efforts we should make to make sure that we can apply the theory successfully in a certain circumstance. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, on the first question, you're asking what if everyone could be educated, everybody could be trained, not like me, but in a useful way. That would be great. The one problem, of course, is that, as I was suggesting, education does not come for free. It requires a serious investment. Someone has to pay for it. And so in the world as it currently exists, it is beyond the resource limitations to educate everyone to be aid workers. That's simply not in the feasible sense. But that isn't to say that we can't make a big improvement over the current reality. We may not be able to educate everyone, but we can educate a lot more D workers than we're doing. So it's moving in the right direction that I'm arguing for, not achieving some utopia, which is unrealistic. Now, on the second question, what can we do to bring the countries of the world to the point where considerations like these are even applicable? The sad fact is that there are some countries which are still more or less left out of the globalization project altogether. And you mentioned Myanmar as an example. Sadly, Myanmar, partly through deliberate choices by its government, it has not been able to take advantage of the possible fruits of globalization nearly to the extent that Thailand has, or that Mexico has, or that Brazil has. I guess for teachers like me, educators like me, the task is to try to make clear that although globalization brings problems with it, such as inequality, and I've been emphasizing inequality today, but there are other problems too, globalization is not something to be feared. That is, there is something you can do about the problems. And there are, of course, great benefits as well. I hope that through education, through understanding, countries which have deliberately cut themselves off from globalization will reconsider and join the international, more thoroughly join the international community.
Thank you very much.
Professor Maskin, in a globalized world, it is quite likely that a worker will relocate to this CD country, and at the same time, A could be working with 2D, for example, and the D can be improved to D+. And how would that look like?
So you're suggesting that A workers may actually migrate and move to the other country. Well, if you actually accept the premise of this theory, that's actually not going to happen. And the premise behind this theory is that communication costs have been reduced to the point where it's no longer necessary to move to another country to enjoy the wages of that other country. Notice that in the arguments that I was making, the C workers did not have to move to the rich country to match with the B workers. They stayed in their own country. It was the international employer that hired them that did the moving. The workers just stayed at home. So that's also an important difference between the contemporary world and the world of 100 years ago. 100 years ago, if you wanted to earn wages comparable to American workers' wages, you had to move to America. You don't have to do that anymore. You can stay put and get hired by a multinational company instead.
Are you saying that? Sorry to take up your time again. Are you saying that you have actually de facto now equalization of wages of the same skill level?
That would be an exaggeration. Of course, there are still important international differences for the same skill level, but the differences are shrinking. And the differences have...
But in the model, it is equalized.
In the model, yes. In the pure model that I showed you, they are equalized. And in the model, it doesn't matter where you are. The same skill level will be paid the same no matter what part of the world you live in a world which is globalized. In reality, we are not completely globalized. There are still some differences from country to country, but they are much smaller than they used to be.
I have two questions. First, unlike the Ricardian comparative advantage theory, you mentioned that the A worker would be worse off. So would this imply that the inequality in the rich country will be better after trade?
So you're saying, will inequality be better after globalization in the rich country? It could go either way, actually. It depends on the numbers. For some parameter values, it could be improved, but I could choose other parameter values where we actually got more inequality. To do that, I actually need more than 4. I've been working for simplicity with 4 levels, but if we had more than 4 levels, the inequality could go either way in the rich country. However, in the poor country, inequality definitely goes up as a result of globalization.
Okay. And the second question, you already mentioned that for many Southeast Asian countries, we have seen the result similar to Mexico. But let's imagine that like Thailand in the future, we will trade with both the richer countries and maybe with the poorer country like Cambodia and Laos. Does your theory have some strong prediction on what would happen in middle country like that?
Right. So Thailand is a country in between. It's not one of the poorest countries in the world. Cambodia and Laos are poorer. But China is richer, and what will happen, according to the theory you're asking, if if we remove trade barriers. And in fact, that's precisely what the China ASEAN free trade area is trying to do, to remove trade barriers. And the answer is that for a country in the middle like Thailand, it could go either way. There is no strong prediction. Inequality could increase as a result of the new free trade area, or it could go down. But for Cambodia and Laos, it's pretty clear that inequality will rise as a result.
Didn't globalization start because companies, this current phase of globalization start because companies went looking for D workers? And an example like China and Vietnam are prime examples where they went looking for D workers simply because they were unskilled and they were had very low wages, and there was opportunities to skill them up. In a country like Thailand, that 65% of its GDP is focused on exports, but the farm workers are actually very marginalised out of that and could be considered the D workers. Isn't that really a political problem as opposed to a globalisation problem?
Well, first of all, I do not completely agree with your premise that the current globalization occurred because companies went looking for D workers. The current globalization occurred because costs, communication costs, coordination costs, managerial costs, fell to the point where it became feasible and desirable, and in some cases desirable, to hire workers from a remote part of the world. Before, if you were an American company or a British company or a French company, it would have been very expensive for you to outsource a large part of your operation to Asia. Now it's cheap to do. And the implication of it being cheap to do is that, yes, it now becomes profitable sometimes to hire fairly low-skill workers. Typically, the workers who are not getting hired are workers without any skills altogether, the D workers. They're more like C workers. But other workers who are getting hired might have higher skills. So globalization has made possible the participation of a whole range of skill levels in the international arena, where before these workers would not have had international opportunities. The only people who are not getting so many opportunities are the people at the very bottom. And that yes, I mean, you could say that that's a political problem because the governments of these people aren't giving them the economic wherewithal to make themselves attractive to international markets. But at another level, I would argue that it's an economic problem. These people simply aren't employable anymore.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Maskin. And thank you again for our lovely participants. I know that there are still a lot of questions, but you will have an opportunity to discuss with Professor when we have the refreshment outside. Okay? So on this occasion, I'd like to have an honor of our president of the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce to present our token of appreciation to Professor Maskin. May I call upon Associate Professor Dr. Jiraret Usawat. We also would like to have the group picture from the administrators.
Yeah.
May I invite the administrators to have the group picture with Professor Maskin.
Thank you.
And for our participants, you can enjoy the refreshment outside, and we would love you to come back again whenever we have this kind of special event. Thank you very much.
Largest conglomerate in Thailand, the one who make the A, B, C, D for you.
ติดโปรไฟล์เลยวะไปเดินเล่นก่อนเดี๋ยวมา